I'm Steve Goldman. I'm the director of the Center for Free Enterprise at the University of Louisville. I want to welcome you to our final event for the Fall 2020 Menard Lecture Series. I also want to thank the Menard family for the generous support of our programming. Today's event is jointly sponsored with many of the universities whose names were listed on the slides you saw prior to starting this event. We also want to give special thanks to the Institute for Humane Studies for hosting this event on Zoom, providing technical support, and handling the registrations from all the different universities involved. Today, we're fortunate to have Matt Ridley as our speaker. Matt will discuss his newest book, How Innovation Works and Why It Flourishes in Freedom. Matt is the author of several other books, including The Rational Optimist. He's also a biologist, newspaper columnist, and a member of the House of Lords. He spoke here at the University of Louisville several years ago, and I'm hoping to bring him back live one of these days once we get over this pandemic. So before Matt begins, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A portion of Zoom at the bottom of your Zoom page. And so with that, I want to welcome Matt and listen to what he has to say. Thank you. Welcome, Matt.
Thank you, Steve, very much indeed for that kind introduction. And it's great to be back in Louisville, albeit virtually. And it's great to be back with the Institute for Humane Studies. And I just wish we could meet in person. But through the magic of innovation, we are in a position to enjoy each other's company virtually, at least. I'm speaking to you from the northeast of England. You are all over the US. This is an incredible thing, really, when you think about it. It would have been incredible in our parents' day or our grandparents' day, let alone our great-grandparents. And that's my theme, innovation. Innovation matters. It matters enormously. It's the main theme of human history over the last couple of centuries. The main reason we are incredibly much better off, both materially and in all sorts of other ways, living longer, less likely to die of diseases, all these kind of things, than previous generations. Why poverty has gone to unprecedentedly low levels in the world. And we need more of it, not less of it. I think the COVID pandemic has driven home that message that innovation is important. We need innovation in vaccines, in diagnostic devices. It would have been good if we'd had more of them, more of those innovations, not fewer, in the years leading up to this pandemic. So I hope this pandemic has reminded us that innovation is generally a good thing and is an incredibly important thing. And we should do everything we can to make sure that it flourishes in the 21st century. And what does help it flourish? Well, my starting point when I wrote my book, How Innovation Works, was to say that actually, we don't really know. We don't understand this phenomenon, even though it's incredibly important and widespread. We understand bits and pieces about it, but we haven't really got a clear idea of why it happens, when and where it does, why it happens in some industries and not others, why it happens to us and not to other species, why it happens fast at some times and slow at other times. And those are the sorts of questions I set out to tackle, to understand this strange, ubiquitous phenomenon that we have going on in our society. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you some slides so you don't have to just look at my face for the next 40 minutes, and then look forward to conversation with questions after that. And I want to start with a graph. So if I click share screen, with any luck, you will see a chart. That's mortality from malaria between 1990 and 2003. The blue block is Africa, the red is Asia, and the rest is the rest of the world. And as you can see, at that time, malaria mortality was increasing, and the increase, if anything, was accelerating. And there was a lot of prediction at the time that malaria was going to get worse in the 21st century, particularly because of climate change, enabling mosquitoes to live at higher altitudes and higher latitudes than they had before, and so on. So there was a lot of pessimism about malaria. And although there were anti-malarial drugs and programs to exterminate mosquitoes going on, they clearly weren't winning. And then what happened next was that graph went into reverse. And from 2003, the peak of malaria mortality has roughly halved globally. What happened in 2003? An innovation. it can't really be called an invention because it's not really very new or complicated. It's just putting together two old technologies. One was insecticides and the other was mosquito nets. The insecticide impregnated bed net is what bent that graph down almost entirely, or rather more than all the other measures put together. And so I set out to try and find out who came up with this innovation. Whose idea was it to start to distribute insecticide-treated bed nets in Africa, especially? And I ended up talking to a Frenchman called Frédéric Dariet, who had done experiments in Burkina Faso in 1983, which had proved brilliantly, and they were very well-designed experiments, that a mosquito net was quite good at stopping you getting bitten, but a mosquito net with insecticide painted on it was much better. And that was true even if there were holes in the mosquito net. And of course, there nearly always are holes in a mosquito net after a certain amount of time. And so it was the deterrent effect of this insecticide on the mosquito net that was vital. The Gates Foundation particularly took up this technology. Technology is too fancy a word for this. It's a very simple, low-tech thing, really, and promoted it. And it is the technology that is changing malaria mortality throughout the world. So that's just an example of what innovation can do and how it can be quite low-tech, quite simple, come from very obscure origins, and we don't really know about it. I mean, I bet you've never heard of Frédéric Dariet before. He's not famous. He didn't get rich. He didn't get the Nobel Prize. He should have done, in my view, or he and his colleagues at least. That's the kind of prize that there is out there if we continue to encourage innovation. And as I will come to at the end, the real way to encourage innovation is to encourage freedom. Innovation is the parent of prosperity, but it is the child of freedom. So after telling 30 or 40 stories like that in my book, I then try and boil down in a chapter called Innovation's Essentials what the themes that are emerging from these stories are. Everything from steam engines to search engines, from vaccines to vaping. And these are the sorts of lessons that I think we can learn about innovation, what it is and how to make it flourish. It is different from invention. It is serendipitous. There's quite a lot of accident involved. It's gradual. It's not nearly as sudden and disruptive as we often make out. It's evolutionary. That is to say, there's descent with modification, and natural selection goes on between ideas. It's recombinant. Nearly all new ideas, new technologies are combinations of existing ideas or previous ideas. It's a team sport, not an individual pursuit. People who try and do it on their own are very rarely as successful as people who realize that it's a much more collaborative exercise. All great innovators talk about the importance of trial and error. It's inexorable. Once it starts in a certain field, you can't stop it, and it becomes inevitable that certain things will get invented. But it's unpredictable. It's very hard to see where it's going in advance, despite that. That's a paradox, which I'm very interested in. There's a weird hype cycle whereby it's slow to take off once an innovation arrives, but then it suddenly accelerates rather later on. And that catches people by surprise. People think a technology is not making much of a difference, and then suddenly it starts to do so. Think of the internet, for example. It is the seed of science just as much as it is the fruit of science. We tend to think of science as being upstream of innovation. That isn't always the case. Quite often it's the other way around. Technology and innovation happens, and then science has to come along and explain what's going on. It doesn't destroy employment, it creates it, albeit in new forms, and albeit with the possibility of greater leisure time and longer periods in retirement and education at the beginning and end of life. It's potentially infinite because we can do more with less. We can have an innovation that halves the amount of resources we need to produce a certain outcome. It likes fragmented governance. It doesn't like empires. It likes continents that are broken up into different states competing with each other, like North America for much of the 20th century, or like Europe for much of the last few centuries. And it flourishes in freedom. And that's the main theme that I want to come to at the end. So let me go through those and give you some examples of what I'm talking about. Innovation is different from invention. Malcolm McLean, the guy who drove the revolution of container shipping, whereby instead of unloading lorries, unloading trucks into the holds of ships and reloading them at the other end, you simply take whole containers that come off the back of a truck and go into the hold of a ship. That transformed trade, dramatically collapsed the cost of trading across the world, and is probably responsible more than anything else for the growth of world trade in the last half century. That wasn't an invention. There was no new technology involved. It was an innovation, though. And there's a nice story. So I think we have underestimated the importance of innovation and focus too much on invention. We think that if you invent a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door, but it's not true. You have to do a lot of work to make an invention available, affordable, reliable before you can make it take over the world. And that is a much harder job. And that's sort of what I think we need to concentrate much more on. Here's a nice story to illustrate the point I'm trying to make. It was told originally by Charles Townes, the inventor of the laser. A beaver is looking at the Hoover Dam. And he says, no, I didn't build it, but it is based on an idea of mine. And all too often, the inventor goes around saying, I deserve more credit. I invented the original idea. The innovator who turned that into something really practical actually does deserve a lot of the credit. Innovation is serendipitous. That word means accidental, means that there are changes of course. People set out to invent one thing, they end up inventing something different. Here are two very nice examples. The Post-it note invented at 3M, Kevlar invented at DuPont. Both examples of things invented by people looking for something completely different, who then stumbled on something that they thought was useless, and then they thought about it a bit more and said, no, hang on, this is even more valuable than I'd thought. So at 3M, they were looking for a permanent glue that worked with paper. They didn't find one. They found a temporary glue that just didn't stick. It kept coming off too easily. And then Art Fry had to go and do choir practice in his local church. And he thought, you know what, this is ideal for keeping my place in the hymn book when I'm in the church. And the Post-it note was born. It's a really nice little example of how you have to be prepared to change direction if you want to be an innovator. You have to be prepared to change your mind, to be alert to the possibility of things giving you different opportunities than what you thought you were giving. Now, innovation is more gradual than we think. This is an odd thing to say when we're obsessed with disruptive innovation today, and we think about the extraordinary, disappearance of the CD in the place of streamed music or something as being a very sudden phenomenon. But the more you examine innovations, the more you realize that actually they are gradual. There is a build-up before they take over the world, and there is a continuing process of improvement after they take over the world. This is my favorite example of this. This is Moore's law, the law that tells you how fast computers will improve in terms of calculations per second per $1,000 over time. Gordon Moore in the mid-1960s said these technologies seem to be improving at the rate of about a doubling every 18 months. And having discovered that, he ought to have been able to say, okay, well, if it's going to double in 18 months, why don't we make it quadruple in 18 months? Why don't we jump ahead? If we're going to be able to get there in 3 years, why don't we get there in 1.5 years? And that turned out not to be possible. Moore's law held as a generalization for practically half a century. It's beginning to lose its force today because computer transistors are getting so small that there's nowhere left to go. But each technology was necessary for the next one. You had to build a chip of a certain density before you could build a chip of the next density, and so on. And here's the really interesting thing that this chart shows, which was drawn by Ray Kurzweil. The invention of the integrated circuit, the invention of the transistor taking over from the vacuum tube, they didn't make an enormous difference. The first of the new technology was not much better than the last of the old technology. And in fact, Moore's law has been in operation right the way back to 1900. So it's the incredible revolution in computing that we've seen in the 20th century has actually been a surprisingly gradual phenomenon when you look at it in this way. It's not only gradual, it's evolutionary. You can trace the evolutionary descent of our tools and our rules. You can see them. You can see their family trees, their pedigrees. The first motor car looks like a cross between a carriage and a locomotive, with maybe a little bit of bicycle thrown in as well. This is the evolution of the mobile phone, how it got smaller and then it got bigger again, an interesting pattern of technology. Evolution is a very specific phenomenon that works through natural selection. And here's a French philosopher by the name of Alain, his real name was Émile Chartier, in 1908, making a really interesting point, I think, about technology. When you go in a ship or a boat or a plane, you think that it was designed by an intelligent designer, right? You know, the engineer, the architect, the builder who built this thing knew what he was doing, right? Well, yes and no, because the builder of that airplane wasn't starting from scratch. He was taking a previous design and adapting it, and so on, all the way back to the Wright brothers in 1903. So here's Alain making that point about boats. Every boat is copied from another boat. Let's reason as follows, in the manner of Darwin. It's clear that a very badly made boat will end up on the bottom after one or two voyages and thus never be copied. One could then say with complete rigor that it is the sea herself who fashions the boats, choosing those which function and destroying the others. And in that sense, it's a bottom-up evolutionary phenomenon, not a top-down one. Now, one characteristic feature of evolution is that it works by recombining existing genes. It works by not necessarily inventing new genetic sequences very often, more but just shuffling them around through a process called sex, which is the purpose of which seems to be to bring genes into new combinations to give you new new biological devices. Exactly the same is true of human innovation. Pretty well every technology you can think of consists of a combination of existing technologies, a novel combination of those technologies. This is my favorite example. It's called the pill camera. It takes a picture of your insides if you swallow it. It came about after a conversation between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer over a garden fence. That's the process that I called in a previous book, Ideas Having Sex. And I mean it quite literally, because the biological sex is a pretty precise analogy here. And this, I can't resist, some of you will have seen me show this slide before, but I can't resist showing it to you again, because I think it captures what innovation has achieved for the human race in 500,000 years. This is an object that sits on my desk at home. It's called the Ashwalian hand axe. It's the kind of thing that was used by Homo erectus 500,000 years ago. Beautifully designed piece of stone with a sharp edge for, you know, butchering animals or something like that. And right next to it is an object of exactly the same size and shape. And this just blew me away when I first noticed the similarity. These two objects are both designed to fit the human hand, 500,000 years apart. It sends a shiver down my spine. But the really interesting thing is the difference between them, because whereas the object on the left is made from one substance, the one from the right is made from plastic and silicon and metal, and it was made by lots of different people. Indeed, it embodies ideas that occurred to different people at different times and different places. It combines them. And that's what we're so good at in our innovation systems, is combining ideas and technologies. It wouldn't happen if we weren't obsessive about exchange, about the habit of swapping things with each other. It's a peculiar human feature. As Adam Smith famously said, no man ever saw a dog make fair and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog. It just doesn't come naturally, even to chimpanzees, but it does come naturally to us. It's part of our nature to exchange. And that's what enables us to do this recombination of ideas to make technologies. Now, that means that you have to be talking to other people if you want to innovate. It's no good trying to do it on your own. And there's a really nice cautionary tale to drive that home. This is a picture of a famous event in December 1903, which was widely attended by lots of people watching, and was expected to be one of the most momentous events in the history of technology. A man named Langley, Samuel Langley, who was the head of the Smithsonian Institution and a brilliant astronomer, had been given an enormous grant by the US government to build an aeroplane, a powered plane. And he had combined an engine with some wings and a tail. And because he was so clever, he had designed it all himself. He'd kept it totally secret, showed it to nobody, talked to nobody. And then he put it on top of this houseboat on the Potomac. His pilot, Mr. Manley, climbed onto the craft and powered up the engine and fired away. And as you can see, it's going straight into the water. It went about 20 yards and crashed. Mr. Manley had taken the precaution of putting a life jacket on, so he swam away safely and all was well. The government was furious. Langley's reputation never recovered. It was a disastrous venture. 10 days later, on a barren island off North Carolina, two humble bicycle mechanics from Ohio with no budget succeeded in getting an airplane into the air. Just 10 days later, exactly the same month, 1903, December 1903. And what they had done that Langley didn't was that they had shared ideas. They had drawn upon everybody and everything who was thinking about flight that they could find in the world, particularly a guy called Octave Chanute in Chicago, who had turned into a sort of node in a network for collecting ideas about flight, about gliders, about kites, about engines, about the shape of wings, about the type of propeller you needed, about how to steer when you're in the air, all these different questions. And Chanute was convinced that an Australian named Lawrence Hargrave was going to be the first person to achieve this, because he was doing incredible experiments with box kites and other things, which were way ahead of everybody else. But Hargrave's Hargrave's ideas ended up being incorporated into the Wright's machines to a significant extent. They weren't stealing ideas; they were sharing ideas. They knew that the right approach was a team approach, a collaborative approach, and that seems to me to be a terribly important lesson about the story of innovation. It echoes, I think, quite nicely the famous essay "I Pencil" by Leonard Read, with its brilliant idea about a pencil trying to find out how it came into existence and discovering that it's the result of an enormous collaboration between millions of people, some of whom cut down trees, some of whom mine graphite, some of whom grow coffee that is going to be drunk by these other people, and so on. They're all collaborating to make this pencil, and not one of them actually knows how to make a pencil. Innovation depends on trial and error. This is a universal rule. Most innovators say it when you ask them closely. Art Fry, Jeff Bezos, Thomas Edison, they often emphasize the importance of trial and error. I have not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work, said Edison. And boy, did he do a lot of trial and error. When Edison wanted to perfect his light bulb, he took the first prototype and he then looked, or got his staff to look, at 6,000 different types of plant material to find the perfect fiber for the filament of the light bulb that would burn for a long time and not break too easily. That was what he was after, reliability of the light bulb. And he was prepared to try and try and try again until he found a particular type of Japanese bamboo, as it turned out, that made a good filament for a light bulb. So he got the point, Edison, more than anyone else, that this is a process of trial and error. It's not about the cleverest person knowing the answer in advance, like Samuel Langley did. You know, the Wright brothers did years and years of experiments with gliders and kites before they even tried to put an engine on one of their devices. This is an important way you need to do it. Edison also famously said, invention is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. And this is what he meant. Talking of light bulbs and Edison, there's a really weird thing about the light bulb. 21 different people came up with the idea of the light bulb in the same era, independently of each other around the world. Here in the northeast of England, we're very proud of a man named Joseph Swan, who beat Edison to producing a workable light bulb and gave a lecture about it, which was illuminated by the light bulb. But in Russia, they have a similar story about a guy called Lodygin, and then there was Maxim, and there was, the list is long. And as far as we can see, these weren't snooping on each other. These weren't pinching the idea from each other. These people were genuinely doing independently coming up with the same thing. Now, what's going on here? Because this phenomenon is very common, as Kevin Kelly shows in his book, What Technology Wants. It's very common to find that almost every discovery or invention has a bunch of people saying, hang on, I also invented that. I deserve a patent or a Nobel Prize as well. And it's not because some deity leans down from the sky and implants the idea of a light bulb in 21 different brains on different parts of the planet. It's because the technology is ripe and ready to go. It's because the technologies that you need to combine to make a light bulb have reached the point where people will inevitably try it. Technologies of electricity, but also of glass blowing, of vacuum creation, and so on. You can see this more clearly with a more recent example. Think of the search engines of the early 1990s. There's Google and Yahoo and Ask and all the other ones. And there were lots and lots of different ones. Google certainly wasn't the first. It was the most successful. But imagine that you making the argument that that it depended upon Google. If Google hadn't come into existence, we would not have search engines. That makes no sense, does it? I mean, it's obvious that once you've invented the internet, you're going to invent search engines. They are, I think, probably the most useful invention of my lifetime. I use them pretty well every day, and I can no longer imagine life without them. They're very important, but we didn't need an inventor to invent them. They were bound to get invented in the early 1990s when we had invented the internet. And yet, here's a paradoxical feature. Nobody saw them coming. If you look in the late 1980s at what people are saying about this internet thing that's coming along, almost nobody says search is going to be really important. The ability to find what you want on this new platform. Even the people who did it didn't realize how important it was going to be. And some of them didn't realize what they were doing. Larry Page and Sergey Brin, when they invented Google, thought they were cataloging the internet. They didn't realize that they were making a device, a search engine, that was going to be very simple, very useful, and very profitable. It took them a long time to twig that they had invented the most lucrative possibility on the internet. So why is it that looking backwards, it looks obvious that search engines would be invented then, but looking forwards, it does not? This asymmetry in time is something that fascinates me, and I don't think I fully understand it yet, but I think it's an intriguing feature of innovation. And it leads us to get the future wrong again and again and again. This is a drawing of the future for the year 2000, I think, done in 1958, the year I was born, and it shows what's going on in the future. People are still having ordinary letters delivered home to home, but the mailman has a rocket on his back, so he can jump from house to house. All the predictions in the 1950s about the future are obsessed with transport. They want personal jetpacks like this. They want gyrocopters. They want routine space travel. They want supersonic airlines, and so on and so forth. And almost none of that happened. The 747 is only now going out of service after 51 years of dominating long-haul routes. Transport has changed extraordinarily little in my lifetime. It changed an enormous amount in my grandparents' lifetime. They were born before the Wright brothers flew and before the first proper motor cars, but they died with Men on the Moon and Concorde in the air. So they lived through incredible changes in transport. I've lived through very little change in transport. Sure, it's got safer and more reliable and cheaper and all that kind of thing, but it hasn't got faster. It hasn't, new forms of it haven't really come along. On the other hand, communication and computers has changed extraordinarily in my lifetime, and it hardly changed at all in my grandparents' lifetime. They were born after the telephone and they died with the telephone. They had telegrams, big deal. They had them all along too. They really didn't see much change before they died in around 1970. Whereas now, look what we're using for this lecture. We're communicating extraordinarily. And I think it's that weird asymmetry between the inevitability of technological changes in some fields and our inability to see them coming that results in these mistaken forecasts about the future. Not everybody got everything wrong. This is a German drawing from the 1920s, I think, showing how communication will happen in the future. And boy, did they get it right. Look, they're doing exactly what we're doing now. I think that's quite impressive. So there are some good predictions. But just to rub the point in, here are some embarrassingly stupid remarks about the future from some extremely clever people. Ernest Rutherford, the winner of the Nobel Prize for essentially splitting the atom, says anyone who expects a source of power from the transformation of the atom is talking moonshine. And he says that in 1933. Ken Olsen, the chairman of the Digital Equipment Corporation, which made the mini computer, which is one of the most successful computer companies of the 1970s, by making smaller computers, says there's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. Paul Krugman, the Nobel-winning economist in 1998, says by 2005 or so, it will become clear that the internet's impact on the economy will have been no greater than the fax machines. And Steve Ballmer, the chief executive of Microsoft, says there's no way the iPhone's going to get significant market share. No chance. And that's in 2007. So the future is very hard to foresee in technology. Don't fall for anybody who says they know what we're going to be doing in 2030, let alone 2050. The people are constantly asking me to write things about the future of technology. And I'm nearly always, sometimes I make the mistake of saying yes, but nearly always I insist that you will only get stupid things out of me if you ask that. Now, one of the reasons for this, I think, is what I call the Amara hype cycle. Roy Amara was a computer scientist in California in the 1960s who said something that a lot of people have attributed to Arthur C. Clarke, but actually it was Amara who said it first. And I think it's a very profound remark. He said, we underestimate the impact of a new technology in the long run, but we overestimate the impact in the short run. And essentially he's describing a sigmoid curve. So instead of a straight line for the adoption of a new technology, it's slow to start with, then it speeds up, and then it slows down again. And if you think about recent technologies, you can sort of see that happening. The internet, I think, is no longer disappointing. In fact, it's rather exceeding our expectations of 20 years ago, as Paul Krugman rather infamously pointed out. Genomics, well, if you go back and look at the year 2000, what Bill Clinton said about the sequencing of the human genome and how it was going to lead to the curing of cancer in a short period of time, it looks a bit embarrassing. Genomics has been disappointing in terms of its applications, with the exception of forensics and various other areas where it's having a big impact. But I think that era of disappointment is probably over. I think we're going to see some pretty spectacular results out of genomics in the years to come. AI of the modern kind that we get so excited about at the moment, I suspect it's got a little bit of disappointing still to do. I don't think we're going to see driverless cars as quickly as some people are saying. Whoops, there I go making a prediction about the future. I said I wouldn't, but I just did. And as for blockchain, I think it's hardly begun to disappoint us yet. But at some point, it will definitely, not definitely, it will probably transform the world pretty dramatically. Now, one of the nice features about innovation is that it has a strange relationship with science. It isn't the same thing as scientific understanding. And here's an example of why. The woman on the left is called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and she was the wife of the British ambassador to Constantinople in the early 1700s. And she brought back to Britain the idea of inoculation against smallpox. And then on the right, there is how smallpox inoculation was brought to America. It was brought by a slave, a man named Onesimus, which was the name of a Roman slave that was given by the preacher Cotton Mather to his slave. And with a smallpox epidemic in Boston, Onesimus said to Mather, where I come from in Africa, we give kids a little dose of smallpox from someone who's survived, and that makes them immune. And Mather persuaded Zabdiel Boylston to try it, and they inoculated 250 people, and nearly all of them survived the epidemic, whereas other people didn't. But it was an incredibly unpopular thing to do. And both he and Lady Mary Wortley Montagu were vilified for their dangerous suggestion that you should deliberately give children a fatal disease. My point is that we were nearly, 250 years away from understanding the science behind this innovation at this point, that actually there was a long way to go before you understand science. The technology, the innovation came first, the science came second. It isn't always that way, but it quite often is. Think about, for example, the science of thermodynamics coming out of the steam engine rather than vice versa. And that's still happening today. People think, well, it's different today. Today, we always start with science, and then we do technology after that. And sometimes we do. But actually, the relationship between science and technology is very complicated. This is the story of CRISPR, the brand new gene editing tool that is showing enormous promise in our ability to transform not only medical treatments, but also agricultural improvements and so on. It's very exciting new technology. And the Nobel Prize was given for it a few weeks ago to Jennifer Doudna of Berkeley and Émile Charpentier in France. They are academics. This looks like a purely scientific discovery in academia that is now being applied in the real world. But actually, when you look into the story of it, it gets a bit more complicated because they really got the idea from the yogurt industry. Philippe Horvath in France was working for the yogurt industry, and he was trying to understand how bacteria resist viral infections. It's very important for yogurt businesses to not have sick bacteria because bacteria are their workhorses. And he had picked up an idea from an academic in Spain who was working on salt-loving bacteria, salt-loving microbes, they weren't bacteria, from an area where there was a big salt industry. And they had found these strange sequences with palindromes in the bacterial genomes, which were effectively libraries of virus genomes to alert the bacterium as to what to go out and destroy when you found it in your cell. This proved to be a mechanism that could be used for very precise gene recognition. It goes from academia to industry, back to academia again, and now back to industry again. It's a much more complicated story than that of technology just being the fruit of science. It is the seed of science as well. A couple of other features of innovation that are terribly important. It does not destroy jobs, as I said. Back in the 1960s, President Johnson had a commission to look into what on earth we were going to do to fill our time when all the computers had been introduced into factories and there was going to be mass unemployment. The same worries about threshing machines in the early 1800s in England, and the same worries about driverless cars today. Today, it is not factory workers, but lawyers and doctors who are worried about losing their jobs to machines. So suddenly we're supposed to worry even more about it because these people are influential. It's not going to happen. We always create new types of work. There will always be something else that we want each other to do. But yes, we will have more leisure time. We already have more leisure time. If you live into your 80s today and you work a 40-hour week for half your life and spend the rest of your life either in education or retirement, which is a pretty typical pattern, then you will have spent 10% of your life at work, 90% of it not at work, either asleep or watching a movie or retired or whatever. It's quite an interesting thought that just for 10% of your life supplying things to other people, you can have all your worldly needs supplied by other people. And the other really interesting feature of innovation is that people say you can't have infinite innovation in a finite world because you'll run out of resources, you'll run out of metals or energy or something. But that's not true. You can have infinite innovation, I reckon, because once you've invented the last thing, you can then invent a version of it that uses less fuel or uses less material. And we're doing that all the time. We're dematerializing our economies. The US economy now uses less stuff overall than it did a few years ago, even though it has vastly more people to supply. We get 68%, we use 68% less land to produce the same amount of food now as we did 50 years ago. There's 13% as much aluminum in a drinks can as there was 40 years ago, et cetera, et cetera. So an awful lot of innovation consists of doing more with less. And that process, in theory, can go on infinitely. Now, I want to make the point that empires are bad at innovation. The Ottoman Empire, the Ming Empire in China, the Roman Empire, on the whole, these are huge, wealthy, free trade areas that ought to be brilliant at innovation, but they're not. And why are they not? Because they are top-down organizations that try and direct people from the center. They try and tell people what to do. They don't give freedom to individuals to go out and innovate. And that is a lesson that is terribly important for understanding the world, in my view. When Europe was fragmented into lots of different nations from 1500 onwards, it was very inventive. When America was fragmented into 50 different states, as it still is, but increasingly they are obeying the same rules, then they were not very, they were very inventive. The same is true of Renaissance Italy, the competing city-states, or ancient Greece. And I'll come back to China at the moment because it's an interesting case example of that. As you will spot, this makes me very skeptical about the European Union, which doesn't just believe in mutual recognition between countries. If this device is safe for you, then it should be safe for us. That's what mutual recognition means. No, we must have harmonization. We must have exactly the same rules applied in exactly the same way in every part of the continent. That is a recipe for destroying innovation. And sure, as a result, Europe really struggles to innovate these days. It is incapable of producing any digital giants to challenge Apple, Google, Amazon, or their Chinese equivalents. And the reason is because it is too top-down, too centralized. That's why I was in favor of Brexit. We need to find a way of competing with different ways of doing things. And it's not just empires. Big companies are bad at innovation too. Kodak was blown away by digital photography, and Nokia spent far too long thinking that voice was the only reason we were going to use mobile phones, and went from being by far the biggest mobile phone company in the world to being a shadow of its former self, taken over by one of its rivals. Very few big companies remain good at innovation. Some, like Amazon, are pulling it off longer than they should, because people like Jeff Bezos are very insistent on setting up structures and rules to make sure that there is a flow of innovation within the company. I mean, for example, he told me that one secret is to make sure that a maverick with a weird idea somewhere down the bottom of the organization gets heard at the top of the organization, even if everybody on the way up thinks it's a bad idea. There should be a sort of reverse veto. As long as one person is prepared to champion an idea, it can progress up the organization. Now, I want to talk briefly about resistance to innovation, opposition to innovation, because actually we all think we're in favor of innovation, and we're not. Everywhere innovation is tried, there is strong resistance to it. Some of it comes from rival companies, rival organizations that don't want to lose their market share to this new incumbent. Some of it comes from government regulators that think it might be unsafe to try something new, can only think of the downsides of trying something new, not the upsides. Some of it comes from passionate campaigners who are just sort of making a lot of money out of opposing the new and appealing to our caution and our risk aversion. I think, for example, of Greenpeace's continuing opposition to golden rice, the genetically modified form of rice with vitamin A precursors in it, which promises to vastly reduce the death and disability of small children in poor countries in urban parts of the world where they rely on rice for their diet. Lots of grains have vitamin A precursors in them, but rice doesn't. Very easy to put it in. It was done as a humanitarian project, not for profit. Nobody was going to make any money out of it more than 20 years ago. Greenpeace and Greenpeace alone have campaigned hard for over 20 years to stop that technology being used. They are terrified that a genetically modified technology will result in good news in the world, and that's more important to them than 500,000 children a year dying. But just to drive the point home, I want to talk about coffee. Coffee was an innovation in Europe in the 1500s, and wherever it came in, it was banned. It was forbidden. It was had to be stopped. Usually the king, the ruler, the government passed rules against it. This was for two reasons. Firstly, because the wine and beer industry lobbied the government to say, hang on, we don't know this new competitor. Let's say it's dangerous and let's get the government to ban it, just like they would today. There's a wonderful pamphlet from 16-something in Marseille, which is written by a medic, a doctor, saying this new coffee drink is a terrible idea. It dries up your kidneys, destroys your liver, etc., etc., etc. So, this was scientific stuff bought and paid for by a lobby industry, by the wine industry in that case. And the other reason that coffee was unpopular with governments was because coffee houses turned out to be great places to gossip in. And one of the things you might do if you're in a coffee house gossiping is you might talk about whether the king is doing a good job. And you might even mention the possibility that he's not doing a good job. So here's King Charles II of England in 1675 saying, as for coffee, tea, and chocolate and the good they do, only, I can't quite read it because it's gone behind some screens, but he's terrified that people will spend half the day in a coffee house and discourse with everybody on state matters, the broaching of lies and being rude about their governors and insinuating in the people a prejudice against their rulers and magnifying their own parts, decrying that of their rulers. In other words, fake news. And that's not something that kings like to have. I'm going to tell you one beautiful little story, which was there was one king in the 18th century who was told he must ban coffee. He was a king of Sweden, and he said, well, why don't we do an experiment? Let's see if it's true that coffee's bad for you. Brilliant, right. So they got two condemned prisoners who were condemned to death. And they said, instead of dying, we're going to put you in separate cells, and we're going to give one of you tea every day, and we're going to give one of you coffee every day. And you will be watched over by two physicians who will see whether you get healthier or less healthy. Well, the physicians died first, the king next, the tea drinker next, and the coffee drinker was the last to die. So that rather proved that it wasn't dangerous. Now, I said I'd say something about China. And if I'm going to make the case that freedom is important for innovation, freedom to fail, freedom to change your mind, freedom to invest, freedom to express your preferences as a consumer, then how do I explain China being an innovative country? And the way I do so is by saying that actually, in economic terms, China has been a very free country for the last 3 or 4 decades. In political terms, not at all. If your innovation was a new political party, forget it. But if it was a new gadget, if it was a new firm, actually you were very free to set it up. You had far fewer petty rules and bureaucratic obstacles to overcome than you would do in the West. So actually, you were pretty free to set about doing this. You no longer are. The Xi regime is quite different from what has gone on since Deng Xiaoping. it is basically trying to tell every private individual, every private firm what to do and what not to do. And that way lies disaster. That way lies the stifling of innovation. And I'm pretty sure that China will not be able to sustain its very well-deserved reputation as one of the most innovative places on the planet today. This has happened in China before. 1,000 years ago, there was a dynasty called the Song dynasty, which was relatively decentralized. There wasn't a strong center. Merchants were free to run their own cities as they pleased. And it was a bit like the city-states of Italy or the American states more recently, or the countries of Europe at a different time. It was a place of experimentation and rivalry. And as a result, it was incredibly innovative. This was the period when China developed or perfected the first compass, the first gunpowder, printing press, paper money, all these different technologies. It had the beginnings of an incredible revolution that could have turned into the Industrial Revolution. And then the Song dynasty fell, and the dynasties that followed it, starting with the Mongols, but then the Ming dynasty after that, took a very different approach. In the Ming Empire, basically, the emperor and his bureaucrats told everybody what to do. They told merchants whether they could leave their own village to trade elsewhere or not. You had to get a license to do that. They told you to report at regular intervals on how much stock you had in your warehouse and so on. This killed innovation in China. So I think the lesson of China is actually one that does drive home the point about freedom. And for me, all the things I've talked about all boil down to one important lesson, and that is that the way to be innovative in the modern world is to set people free. The main barriers are not lack of money or lack of support from government or something like that. They are simply the obstacles, the regulations, the opposition, the hoops you have to jump through. Imagine how much more we'd have been able to do during this pandemic if people had been free to invent more diagnostic devices. At the moment, it takes 3 or 4 years to get a diagnostic device licensed. It takes no time at all to get a new video game licensed. That's why, as Peter Thiel often says, we have diverted the energy of entrepreneurs from atoms into bits, from real things into digital innovation. Well, with that, I'll stop. I'll remind you that the glass is half full. You've had a very successful democratic transition this week in the US, I think, and the pandemic will end, and the technologies that we have to play with during this century are spectacular. We face a fantastic future so long as we allow innovation to happen. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Matt. And by the way, everybody, you guys should get his book. It's a wonderful book. Our reading group read it, and I've had 2 reading groups read it, and everybody really enjoyed it. And it's really worth the money, so you should definitely go out and buy it. So I'm going to ask the first question because that's my prerogative. And it's a little bit long-winded. Many people say that capitalism leads to poverty. And Mises said this, and hopefully somebody can tell me what book he said this because I can't find it. But he said that people who are in poverty today wouldn't even have existed without capitalism because they wouldn't have ever been born, or they wouldn't have survived because capitalism gave them the goods to survive. And Greenpeace, with what they're doing with the GMO seeds, seems to be proving Mises right, because they're blocking GMOs from these poor countries, and as a result, they're killing 500,000 people. And I'm wondering why it is that Greenpeace, what's in it for Greenpeace to be against these GMOs?
It's a really good question, because, as I said, you can usually find self-interest in opposition to technology. So, for example, there was a huge campaign in 19th century London against this new French invention called the umbrella. And the campaign was basically from the hansom cab operators, because they didn't, the horse-drawn taxis of the day, because they didn't want people thinking they could walk down the street in the rain. They wanted them jumping in a cab instead. So they made up all sorts of stories about how dangerous umbrellas were. Now, in the case of these enormously powerful environmental groups like Greenpeace, and remember that Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and World Wildlife Fund, between them, spend about $1 billion a year. That's an enormous amount of money. In the case of them, it isn't obvious that they have a vested interest in stopping technology. And they will always deny that they're against innovation. But again and again, you find that they actually do set out to stifle and stop innovative ideas being used. A lot of it boils down to versions of the precautionary principle. And the precautionary principle sort of says, look, you don't have to wait for all the evidence before you press pause on a new technology if you think it's going to be dangerous. And that's fine. But the way it's been adopted, largely thanks to Greenpeace lobbying the United Nations before the Cartagena Protocol in about the year 2000, I think it was, the way it's been adopted, it essentially says we must think of all the downsides of an innovation and not think about the upsides at all, including the upside that we might be displacing an existing technology, which itself has downsides, has harms, has hazards. And that philosophy has been immensely successful in raising funds and spreading throughout the world. What's driving it? Because, as you say, it has resulted in the in humanitarian problems of significant dimensions. I think what's driving it is the fact that it is very easy to appeal to people's fear. That project fear works extraordinarily well on human beings. We are risk-averse creatures. Steve, you've frozen, so it's possible that I have lost you. Can you hear me? Oh, no, you were just sitting very still, that's all.
No, actually, I turned my camera off, I thought.
Oh, that's what it was.
So we've got a lot of questions in the Q&A, and
Right.
I can ask them of you, or you can look at them and answer the ones you think you want to answer.
Why don't you ask one, and I'll have a quick look at some of the other ones.
Okay, I'll ask one from a student. It said, in my economics class, we're discussing the difference between economic systems and how they promulgate success. What features of an economic system are most important in fostering innovation? Is it a safety net that allows for people to innovate with less fear of financial ruin, or are there other policies that increase innovation amongst the general population?
You know, I find that quite a difficult question to answer, because although I've said things about empires versus city-states, about policies of dismantling barriers to innovation rather than subsidizing innovators, I recognize that doesn't really boil down to a very specific recipe. And I'm sitting on a couple of UK government committees at the moment, our job being to try and help innovation in the UK. So I ought to be better at answering this question than I am. But I come back to this point, it's a somewhat mysterious process. If I think the important thing is what not to do. Don't pick winners. Don't say to governments, go out there and champion this technology, because that often ends in tears. Don't throw subsidies at things, because you often just entrench existing technologies' power over new ones. Don't impose new regulations in the hope that this will encourage new innovation. It doesn't work that way. The simplest and best strategy at the moment that I see out there is the one called the Advanced Market Commitment, which the Gates Foundation has interestingly employed, which is to say, it's like a prize. It's saying, if you invent this thing, we will reward you with a prize. But it won't be a cash prize. It'll be a purchasing of your product so that you get a decent return on it. So the example that's worked very well is the pneumococcal vaccine, which was a disease killing people in the poor parts of the world. The these are poor people, so they're not going to be able to afford the vaccine. So the Gates Foundation essentially said to the pharmaceutical industry, come up with a pneumococcus vaccine and we'll make sure you get paid properly for every dose you sell. But we'll also make sure that it's affordable for the people who want it. And that has worked very well. There have been 3 good vaccines developed as a result of it. So I'm really intrigued at the moment in the idea of prizes. The Longitude Prize is a famous example in 18th century Britain of, after a naval disaster, offering a prize to anyone who could find the solution to measuring longitude at sea. It was eventually won by a clockmaker from Yorkshire by the name of John Harrison, who simply said, all you need is a reliable, sturdy clock that can survive being on board ship, and it will tell you what the time is in London and the time is where you are. You can tell from the sight of the sun, and you can compare the two and work out how far west you are. Now, this infuriated the grandees of the Royal Society because they thought they deserved the prize as astronomers for solving this problem. They didn't think it should come from a simple clock. So it's a nice example of serendipity too. So that's my answer to that.
Okay, here's one from Russ Sobel. I don't know if you've met Russ before, but you wrote a really nice article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of weeks ago. I really enjoyed it. And it kind of goes along with that. It says, what is your feeling on the massive government restrictions during COVID, and how's that impacting innovation? Businesses in most places aren't allowed to experiment. People aren't either, as has been through history. Externality arguments are used to block freedom. So
yeah, no, I'm really worried about our reaction to COVID. I think we're going to do more harm with these lockdowns. I mean, we entered a new lockdown in the UK today, based on very flimsy reasoning, in my view, and the habit of telling us what we can and can't do has become ingrained in governments, and they will give it up. History teaches us that they won't give it all up at once. They will have to be very insistent on getting it back from them. One of the things they won't give back is the freedom to be innovative. The fact that we can't meet in person, the fact that Steve and I can't go out for a beer this evening after this talk, reduces the chance that he and I will come up with a brilliant, innovative idea over our 15th beer late in the evening. I'm being flippant, but you get the point that you need to. And just to give you a little example of how weird the world has got this year, I was talking to a very distinguished Australian businessman who'd gone back from London to Australia for a couple of months in the summer and then come back again. Now, when you land in Australia, you have to isolate for 2 weeks. And they take this very seriously. You're escorted from the plane by the military. They drive you to a hotel. They lock you in the hotel room for 2 weeks. You are literally not allowed out of the room. Food is brought to the door. And however, being Australians, they say you can have a 6-pack of beer or a bottle of wine per person per day, which is fairly generous. I'm not sure whether you have to pay for it, but that's a detail. However, he said to the military guy outside his door, it's Saturday. Could we have 2 bottles of wine? One for my wife and I. We're going to have a jolly party this evening with us. We're a little bored. And they said, no, you can't have 2 bottles. You can only have 1. He said, but it says 1 bottle per person. And they said, yeah, but if we give you 2 bottles, you might drink both of them, and she might drink neither of them. And so we can't do that. That's against the rules. I mean, just terrifying what government is deciding to tell us what we can and can't do during this pandemic. And please, let's insist on getting all our freedoms back when it's over.
Okay, here's another question from Emily Cook. I know you've argued that intellectual property and patents hinder innovation. Do you think that as a society, we're growing past the need for IP laws and patents, as we are mainly innovating technology and code, which is hard to patent? If not, do you think we ever will?
I think that's a very nice point, that the software industry relies very little on intellectual property. Patents are not much use because basically there's a first mover advantage. You're constantly needing to get ahead. You don't try and rest on your laurels and extract rent from the innovation that you've come up with. I go through the argument in my book as to why I think patents are more of a hindrance than a help to innovation, how I think intellectual property is a bad metaphor. I don't think it is a property system. And on the whole, I think it's pretty hard to make an empirical case that innovation helps intellectual property helps with innovation. And the software industry is a good example of why we would have innovation if we didn't need it. Intellectual property's got very hard to defend in music recently because of streaming. Has that led to a drying up of musical innovation? No, it hasn't. There's plenty of it still going on. So I would like to think that we're moving towards a world in which intellectual property does wither. I'm all for not getting rid of it altogether. I think there are areas, particularly the drugs industry, where you can make a good case for it. And it would be very difficult to go cold turkey to give it up overnight. But I am very struck by how much more important intellectual property is in America than other places. I wrote an essay recently about Australian innovators. And it was a very striking feature of that country that nearly everybody said, no, I don't want to patent this thing, the black box, Helicobacter for ulcers. There were a number of other stories I read about the aviation pioneer that I mentioned, Lawrence Hargrave. None of them wanted to patent their devices. Whereas people like the Wright brothers ended up wasting the best years of their lives in court battles to try and defend their patents against rivals. So I'd like to think that America could follow the rest of the world into being a bit less obsessed with patents. But I'm afraid the opposite is happening. I mean, a few years ago in Parliament here in the UK, we passed a law extending copyright to 70 years after the death of the author. This was entirely because the patent on Mickey Mouse was expiring and Disney wanted a longer rent from it. And we fell into line in Europe and said, okay, so I, as an author, can now view the prospect that when I die, my great-grandchildren might be able to make money out of my books if they're still selling, which I doubt they will be. Well, that's outrageous. My great-grandchildren should get a job. They should, I don't see why on earth they should make money off my books. So there's my rant against intellectual property.
Okay, how about two more questions?
Yeah.
Okay, so here's one from Frank Jimley. I was struck and encouraged in a manner of speaking by your assertion that China's economic rise and accompanying innovation will be snuffed out by the CCP's authoritarianism and repression of basic freedoms. How should the West deal with China's economic larceny in the meantime? And can you guess the chronology of when China's innovation will decline?
No, I can't guess how long it'll take. I think it could be several decades, for example, and we could see a more liberal regime in China at some point, which would be nice. How should we deal with China at the moment? There is no doubt that coming out of this crisis, China is stronger and the West is weaker than it was, both morally and intellectually and politically, as well as economically. And that is a concern. And while I'm a huge fan of free trade, a lot of what China has particularly begun to do under Xi is not free trade. And it is time that we sort of flexed our muscles and became a little more resistant to some of the things that have been going on. So, for example, allowing Huawei into our communication systems. I mean, just think what happened earlier in the spring. The Australian government said there should be a full independent international inquiry into the origin of this virus. China's reaction was to slap trade barriers on Australia. That's simply unacceptable. It was a perfectly reasonable request from Australia, and it is not the way to respond. So I'm afraid we are in a difficult relationship with China going forward, and we have to find ways that do not involve cutting ourselves off from them, obviously, and certainly do not involve more and more conflict, to redress that balance, to get a more even relationship, to give them incentives to come back into the economic system, which they were doing under previous leaders before Xi.
Okay, last question. I think this is an important one. Based on your research, do you think the societal viewpoints of women in history have maybe inhibited innovation due to prejudice, and to what degree? So how's that affected growth?
Ouch. I don't think so. I don't think I've seen any evidence that what you might call a feminine viewpoint has been more resistant to innovation. Is that I think is the argument being made, and I gave some examples in my talk. Lady Mary worked in Montague, but also Stephanie Kwolek, the inventor of Kevlar. There's a wonderful story about vaccines invented by two women, Pearl Kendrick and Grace Eldering, in the 1930s, the whooping cough vaccine, which they did in their spare time as public health officials in Wisconsin. And in basically 4 years flat, which is very fast for a vaccine, and nobody believed them. Everybody said, well, you're just a couple of female technicians. How can you possibly have come up with an effective vaccine? But they had. So there's some wonderful stories of female innovators, and there would have been more, of course, if women had been allowed to be in the workforce more than they are. But I can sort of see that there might be a difference in risk appetite between males and females. I think it's true of other species, that males tend to be risk takers more than females. That isn't necessarily a good thing. I'm not saying one thing is better than the other here, and that might play into it. But no, I don't. I don't take the view that that female influences are generally anti-innovation.
Okay, well, I really want to thank you, Matt. This is a great presentation. It was great to see you again. Hopefully I'll get you on campus. We can sip some good Kentucky bourbon afterwards and have a nice talk in the near future. Also want to thank the audience for being here today and for your thoughtful questions. We're working on our spring semester programming, should have the schedule in a few weeks. So keep an eye on our social media. And until then, everybody stay safe and healthy. And thank you again, Matt. So
thank you so much, Steve. I've really enjoyed it, and great to see you again, and all the best to everybody, and good luck over the next few months.
All right, I guess we're signing out. I'll see you.
Bye-bye.